Last night after our broadcast, we recorded a segment for tonight's telecast about abstract art. There is an exhibit at the Guggenheim Museum. It is called Abstraction in the 20th Century, Total Risk, Freedom, Discipline. Here is that segment. Joining me now to talk about abstraction in the 20th century, Mark Rosenthal, the curator of the exhibit, New York Magazine art critic Mark Stevens, and the artist Frank Stella. Welcome. It's great to have all of you here to talk about this. Mark, first tell me about the exhibit before I turn to the curator and one of the artists represented and one of those people who's instrumental in the flow of abstract art.
You have to tell me, this is the Mark you're talking about here, right?
Yes, yes. Which Mark is that I'm talking about? Yes.
The question is what now?
The question is, sort of define this exhibit. I mean, here you have sort of the history of abstract art. The one art that many people say is sort of definitive American.
It's probably the signature style of the century, in fact, and there's never been an show of abstract art that takes really the full century into account and that looks at the way that abstract art has developed and changed over a long period of time. That's partly why the show is controversial, that it's aroused a lot of talk about what's in, what's out, but it's really taken a very panoramic view of what really is the signature style of the century.
You put it together. First, for you, define for us abstract art.
Well, basically, abstract art is art made by individuals who chose not to have a figure or an apple or a landscape, but chose to make art using what are known as the formal means of painting and sculpture: line, shape, color, mass, and so forth.
And it began when? With whom?
It basically began with Kandinsky. Kandinsky is sort of one of the three musketeers of abstract art. There were many precedents for this kind of thing, but in the hands of Kandinsky, who was a Russian living in Munich, Malevich, a Russian, and Mondrian, a Dutchman who worked part of the time in Paris, abstraction was born in the second decade of the century.
Interesting for me is that it's had ebbs and flows in terms of its what? In terms of its acceptance, enthusiasm for it.
It definitely has, both acceptance as well as creativity. One feels as one looks through the century that there are periods, or really generations, which produced fabulous work, and often a generation may be localized to one place or another. And then there's a kind of digesting of what that generation produced, and sometimes a kind of quiet period in terms of innovations, and then it comes forth again.
Could you see in the latter work of Cezanne and people like that, Matisse, any indication of?
Absolutely. The ground was set or laid, or whatever the right metaphor would be.
Foundation established.
The foundation established in Cubism, absolutely in Cubism, and Cubism came from Cezanne. You know, in art history we have this knee bone connected to the shin bone kind of thing, but there's no question that the ground was laid. But interestingly enough, the artist who could have taken the step chose not to. Picasso was very close to it. He even made one painting that was essentially abstract, and then he stepped back.
And Kandinsky went all the way.
Yes.
And that was what began to define it. All right. Let me take a look. I want to come to Frank and get everybody here. But the first thing we see is a 1913 Black Lines. This is by Kandinsky. Frank, tell me about this, just to get you involved in this.
Well, I mean, it's a painting that really, you know, it's a great choice for Kandinsky, because it's the one painting that you could say, I mean, I think you can say this is just almost completely abstract. I mean, the interesting thing about Kandinsky is that you look at Kandinsky and you look at the paintings that are going to be abstract. And when you read Kandinsky, I mean, he's confident that something's going to happen, but he's not very worried about whether it's going to be completely abstract. In other words, one of the things about Kandinsky is the incredible confidence. I mean, he's not worried about the balance between figuration and abstraction. And in the end, he gets there. And mostly the way he gets there is by taking a painting that could be mountains, figures, a landscape, usually St. George and the Dragon, and he paints it out eventually. He paints over it, and you can't recognize it. And I'm sure that somebody will find some kind of iconographical references in here, but this one's really pretty abstract, and the tilting of it, where there's not a real horizon or a landscape, really sort of, I love the cantilevered effect of it.
Yeah, okay.
And what happens?
All right, I'm going to run through some of these. This is always difficult when I got three great guests and also some things to show you, but I want to do this and I have each of them. All right, this here is a Mondrian composition, 1916. Mark Rosenthal, tell me about it.
Well, Mondrian, in a certain sense, was the early geometrician of abstraction. A geometrician is sort of a simplification of really what he's doing. He's using straight lines. And geometry is a little bit of a simplification, as I say, of what he's really about. But Mondrian localized color within lines, but most of all, for me, he created this great dynamic equilibrium. He was interested in getting activity occurring everywhere on the surface of the painting to eliminate the sense that there might still be a figure.
All right, the next one is the Jackson Pollock, #1, 1950. All of these at the Guggenheim Museum, and we'll talk about what was excluded and what was not excluded after we see some of these. Mark Stevens, tell me about this.
Well, you can see the propulsive force in this painting. What critics have always admired about it, and painters too, is its compositional design, the sense that it implies a space much greater than the space that the painting itself contains. It's a very, very big painting in its feeling and its power, not just in its size and scale. It really has a new feeling of space about it, a new kind of space for artists to work with.
The next, go ahead.
I want to jump in because Mark Rosenthal and both Marks anyway. But the Picasso, this is the painting that Pollock does after he struggles with Picasso, and it's kind of interesting that the step that Picasso didn't take gets taken, and the way it gets taken is kind of interesting here because it's the physicality. I mean, as much as painters admire the painting and as much as we admire it for the aesthetics, the real thing that makes it carry and why it probably carries it more in this way than it does as art is because of the gesture, because the body is behind it. And that's what people attach themselves to.
The next one is Helen Frankenthaler, Before the Caves, 1958.
Well, Helen Frankenthaler was an artist who came soon after Pollock in terms of generation and continued his emphasis on gesture, a really powerful sense of the line and the experience, as Frank was describing, of her body making this dramatic gesture.
The next one is Willem de Kooning, Untitled, 1977. Mark Stevens.
Well, this is a beautiful painting that's just so ripe and luscious. It's like a slightly over-rank garden. People have said that they're kind of boneless at this point, but they're really not. There's a structure. The balances of the form and the color are, I think, very, very beautiful and also kind of over the top. I mean, he's really pushing the string here.
Next one is Frank Stella, Union Pacific, 1960. Mr. Stella, sir.
I want to talk about the de Kooning and the other.
Okay, go ahead. Can we go back to the de Kooning? Or you
No, we don't need to go back. I just want I can just say a thing about the de Kooning. You know, we're talking about abstraction here, and one of the things about abstraction would be that the materials are everything. In other words, and what's really happens in the de Kooning is that the physicality of it, you know, this business about putting salad oil into the oil paint because linseed oil is not greasy enough to make it, you know, so you can smear it around more. And the same thing of the smearing and the dripping in Pollock. Well, anyway, these are things that abstraction would normally lead to. And, you know, now that I look at it, I mean, those are the things that I love, too, and I love those paintings, and I wonder why I did this. But there is a tiny connection, which is that this is in the way that the de Kooning is the messy paint and the Pollock is the drip paint out of the can. This paint is right out of the can too. This is just aluminum paint to paint your fences with, and I just dipped my brush in the can and painted it on the canvas. So it's very direct. It's only the material, and then the idea to hold the material together. But it's very pure painting.
All right. Again, I hate to rush, but I want to get through so we can get some sense of the line, and then we can talk more generally about the whole process and different people's impact and what's happened. The next is Richard Long and Carrara Line. Anyone?
Well, Richard Long is quite interesting in many ways because you could say he's dealing with geometric forms all the time, rectangles and especially circles. But he makes use of natural materials very often, these rocks. So it's as if he's creating a kind of merger with the purity of geometry and whatever associative power there is in taking parts of the land and bringing it to abstraction.
And where is this located at?
Well, the photograph shows you the work at the top gallery of the Guggenheim, at the very pinnacle.
You begin this at the bottom,
yes,
and you go
this
up.
is an exhibition you have to go uphill, unfortunately.
All right, go
Is
ahead,
the wall
Frank.
painting behind it, or
Not
you can't see
yet.
it? No,
The
not
picture
yet.
was
Oh, they're
taken
taken before he
before.
painted
Oh,
on the
before
wall.
the painting.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, the last one is Gerhard Richter, January 1989. Mark Stevens.
Well, Richter is a special case. I mean, he is abstract in many different ways. He's also done lots of figurative work that has a kind of abstract quality to it. And this painting, I think it's quite beautiful, very rich and luscious piece. Mark is a great fan of Richter's, more probably than I am. And
Go ahead.
Would you like to?
More than I am, certainly.
Well, Richter's a complicated person. First of all, I think one has to take artists at face value being the paintings themselves. And these paintings are, to me, fabulously lush, rich, sensational paintings, really in the tradition of Pollock and de Kooning and so forth. He becomes a more complicated person when you start to read what he had to say about making these pictures, but that's another story.
Here is part of this exhibit. It is I mean, taking any particular artist, I mean, there are certain people, you've got 4 or 5 works. I mentioned Rothko, 5, Frank, 4. Was it hard? Obviously it was hard to choose, and people will criticize you for what you left out, and people will criticize you for what you included. So what was the defining sort of
Well, the defining
judgment factor?
Judgment was really to make a fantastic, beautiful exhibition. That was crucial to me. Secondly, along the same lines, I wanted to make an exhibition that wasn't an academic lesson alone. Certainly that's meant to be there subliminally.
But you wanted an experience.
I wanted a great experience. And I felt that the way to do that was not to have 139 works by 139 artists, but to have 139 works by 49 artists, so that the experience of seeing each artist's work would be full. There's a number of artists in this exhibition whose work is very modest in a certain way. And whenever those artists' works are shown with other artists, with just a single example by the first artist, they're lost. They have to be able to create their spell. And I think that's true of a lot of abstract artists. They need to have the space to create the spell, space meaning a group of works.
How long does this run till May?
May 12th. Yes.
Mark Rosenthal is the curator of this at the National Gallery, but he began this, looking at this for some 20 years, and been working on it for 4 or 5. Frank Stella, the artist that all of you know and admire, and Mark Stevens, the art critic for New York Magazine. A segment about a fascinating exhibit at the Guggenheim Museum on Abstract Art recorded last night here. Coming up next, Joseph Brodsky, An Appreciation.